Usually when you step into a medical clinic with a physical ailment, there is this really comforting expectation of mechanical precision.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You want things to be measurable.
Right, like you fall off a bicycle, you fracture your radius, and the diagnostic process is just incredibly straightforward. The X-ray machine fires, the radiation passes through your tissue, and the doctor puts a film up on a light board to show you a jagged white line.
It's visible. It's entirely binary.
Exactly. The bone is either broken or it isn't. But the moment you transition from the physical structure of the body to, the architecture of human cognition, that X-ray machine just becomes entirely useless.
Yeah, you are no longer looking for a broken bone. You are looking for a broken reality.
And the diagnostic landscape shifts from this clear, illuminated certainty into profound, muddy darkness.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, when we deal with the nervous system, particularly the higher cortical functions, we aren't just looking at tissue. We're looking at the biological machinery that generates a person's entire subjective universe. And when that machinery malfunctions, the symptoms aren't a cough or a fever.
Yeah.
The symptoms are fundamental alterations to what a person believes is real, what they can see, or even who they believe their loved ones are.
And that terrifying, fascinating landscape is exactly what we are navigating today. So welcome to this deep dive. This is part one of an exclusive 3-part masterclass series designed specifically for the Enkephalikos channel on YouTube.
And we are dedicating our time here to exploring diseases of the nervous system.
Our map for this journey is an absolute heavyweight text. We're unpacking Chapter 59 of the 6th edition of Principles of Neuroscience. The editors are Kandel, Koester, Mack, and Siegelbaum. And the chapter is titled Disorders of Conscious and Unconscious Mental Processes.
It's a dense one, but so foundational.
It really is. Over the course of this series, our mission is to map out the profound biological and computational divide between the tiny, brightly lit sliver of reality that you consciously experience and the massive, unseen, darkroom data processing happening in your unconscious mind.
And to even begin untangling that divide, we really have to establish a baseline. We have to define a word that gets thrown around casually in daily life, but, it carries an immense dualistic weight in neuroscience.
And that word is cognition.
Exactly. Cognition.
Because when the average person hears cognition, they immediately think of sitting in a quiet room, furrowing their brow, and actively solving a math problem, right? They equate it purely with conscious thought.
Yeah, they think of effort. But in the scientific literature, the definition spans a massive spectrum. At the extreme reductionist end, like the strict cognitive neuroscience view, the term cognitive doesn't necessarily imply thinking at all.
Interesting. So what does it imply?
It is essentially a modern stand-in for information processing. Under this specific definition, cognition is just the computational bridge between raw neural activity and overt behavior.
So it's basically the mathematical algorithm of the brain.
Right? It's the mechanics of how a visual feature like the sharp edge of a table or a motor act, like reaching for a glass of water, is physically represented by the firing rates of populations of neurons.
Pure biological computation.
Exactly. Pure computation. But as we slide to the other end of the spectrum, we arrive at the higher level definition. And here, cognition refers to the complex processes that are fundamental to the actual formation of your conscious experience.
And this aligns a lot more closely with common parlance, right? Thinking, reasoning, remembering.
Yeah, and it traces perfectly back to its Latin root, which is cognoscere.
Meaning getting to know or perceiving.
Getting to know, exactly. The philosophical core of this higher-level definition is that human beings do not passively receive the world like a camera recording video. We know the world by actively applying internal reasoning, memory, and categorization to the raw, chaotic data streaming in from our senses.
So we are actively constructing the world, not just reflecting it.
We are building it from scratch, moment by moment.
And realizing that the brain does this active construction actually triggered a massive paradigm-shifting revolution in psychiatry and psychology. The text highlights this in box 59-1. It completely altered how we approach therapy.
It really did. And to understand the shift, we have to look at what came before it.
Right. So in the mid-20th century, the dominant empirical approach to mental health was behavior therapy. And this emerged from laboratory environments as a direct, almost aggressive pushback against Freudian psychoanalysis.
Yeah, the behaviorists view psychoanalysis as totally unscientific and completely lacking in measurable evidence. They wanted data.
So behavior therapy operated on a very strict premise. Maladaptive behavior is simply a learned response. It relied entirely on the principles established by Ivan Pavlov and B.F. Skinner.
We are talking about classical and operant conditioning here. The strict mechanics of stimulus and response, the internal mental life of the patient, their thoughts, their dreams, their reasoning, was considered a black box.
A black box that was largely irrelevant to treatment.
Completely irrelevant in their view.
If we look at how classical conditioning works, you take an unconditioned stimulus, like the physical pain of being bitten by a dog, which naturally produces an unconditioned response of fear.
Right.
But if a child is bitten by a dog, the brain pairs that physical pain with the visual sight of the dog. So the dog becomes a conditioned stimulus. Now, just seeing a dog, even a harmless puppy, triggers a massive fear response.
And the behaviorist looks at this child and says, well, we don't need to analyze the child's relationship with their mother, and we don't need to ask the child to reason through their fear. We just need to break the mechanical link.
And the treatment for that is extinction therapy. You place the child in a safe environment and repeatedly expose them to the conditioned stimulus, so the sight of a friendly dog, without the unconditioned stimulus of being bitten.
Over time, the nervous system basically learns that the dog no longer predicts pain.
And the fearful response is extinguished. Now, this mechanistic approach is incredibly effective for treating highly specific phobias.
Oh, very effective. But the limitations of behaviorism became glaringly obvious when clinicians try to apply it to complex, pervasive mental disorders.
Like major depression.
Exactly. You can't just put a depressed person in a room with a happy stimulus and wait for them to mechanically stop being depressed.
Right, because depression isn't primarily characterized by a maladaptive physical behavior, like running away from a dog. It is characterized by maladaptive thinking.
Which is precisely what led to the cognitive revolution in therapy. This was pioneered by psychiatrists like Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis in the 1960s. They recognized that the black box of the mind was actually the source of the pathology.
So they developed cognitive therapy by taking the principles of learning and applying them directly to a patient's internal thoughts, attitudes, and beliefs.
Right, because a deeply depressed patient doesn't just have a low mood. They suffer from profound cognitive distortions.
Like what? What's an example of a distortion?
Well, they might exhibit selective abstraction, where they only remember the one negative thing that happened during their day and completely ignored 10 positive things. Or they might hold a really rigid, catastrophic belief that because they failed at one specific task, they are fundamentally worthless and will never succeed at anything.
So the cognitive therapist steps in not to change the environment, but to change the processing software itself.
Exactly. They teach the patient methods to actively identify those negative automatic thoughts as they happen, challenge their logical validity, and actively transform those maladaptive attitudes into objective ones.
It is a therapy based entirely on the premise that you can change how you process the world.
Yes, and the vital necessity of that processing, like the sheer amount of work the brain does to make sense of sensory input, is never more obvious than when the machinery physically breaks down due to brain damage.
Which brings us to a class of neurological disorders that Sigmund Freud actually named long before he developed psychoanalysis. He called them agnosias.
Agnosias, derived from Greek, literally meaning a loss of knowledge.
And agnosias are chilling because they completely strip away the illusion that perception is effortless. Like, let's look at visual agnosia. If you examine a patient with this condition, their eyes are structurally perfect.
Right, their retinas are capturing photons without any issue.
The optic nerve is firing. The primary visual cortex is receiving the raw data. They can see lines, they can perceive colors, they can track movement. The sensory data is flooding in, but they are entirely, profoundly unable to recognize or make sense of what they're looking at.
It's wild. You hold up a coffee cup, and they might describe it as a white cylinder with a curved loop on the side, but the knowledge that it is a vessel for drinking coffee is just gone.
It's a total disconnection between perception and meaning, and there are highly specific subcategories of this, right?
Yeah, prosopagnosia is a really famous one. It's a highly targeted inability to recognize faces. A patient can see the eyes, the nose, the mouth, but those features never synthesize into a recognizable identity.
Even if they are looking at their own spouse.
Even their own spouse. They might have to rely on the sound of their voice or a specific piece of clothing to know who they are talking to.
And auditory agnosia presents exactly the same way, but with sound. The patient hears perfectly, the audiogram is totally normal, but they cannot recognize spoken words. It just sounds like meaningless noise.
Exactly. And the source text also emphasizes that these impairments aren't always the result of a sudden brain injury like a stroke. They can be developmental.
Like they can be present as the brain wires itself from birth.
Right. Dyslexia, for example, can be viewed through this lens as a specific difficulty in the cognitive processing required to learn written language. Autism spectrum disorder is increasingly viewed by some cognitive neuroscientists as involving a deficit in social cognition.
Like a difficulty in processing and learning about other minds and intentions.
Exactly. And in severe psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia, cognition becomes fundamentally dysfunctional.
Yeah.
It actively generates false knowledge. The brain produces hallucinations, which are false sensory perceptions, and delusions, which are deeply held false beliefs.
The overarching lesson from all of these pathologies is that your experience of reality is not a direct reflection of the physical world. It is a highly constructed, heavily processed, and deeply fragile cognitive interpretation.
That is the core takeaway. It's all constructed.
But if our experience of reality is just an elaborate construction, why does it feel so immediate? Like, if cognition literally means getting to know the world through processing, my everyday experience completely contradicts that. When I wake up, I open my eyes and look at the ceiling. I don't feel like I'm running a complex biological algorithm. The ceiling is just there.
It feels instant.
Right. If a patient with agnosia proves that seeing an object and knowing what it is are two different physical steps, it forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. Is our conscious perception actually just a massive unconscious math problem that we are completely blind to?
That is the pivotal question of modern cognitive neuroscience. And to truly understand how the brain computes reality, we first have to look at the history of this idea. Because humanity violently resisted the concept of unconscious processing for a very long time.
Why were they so resistant?
Well, the idea that your brain is doing high-level math in the dark without your permission or awareness was deeply offensive to human sensibilities.
Let's trace that historical battle, because when most people hear the phrase the unconscious, their mind immediately goes to Freud. They think of a psychodynamic unconscious.
Like a hidden basement of the mind filled with repressed emotional traumas, unacceptable sexual desires, hidden motivations.
Exactly. But the source material for our deep dive today points to a different figure. A physicist and physician named Hermann von Helmholtz, who proposed an idea about the unconscious that was far more mechanically disruptive to neuroscience.
Yes, he introduced the concept of unconscious inference.
And Helmholtz was operating in the mid-19th century, right? Long before neuroimaging.
Oh yeah, long before. He approached the nervous system not as a philosopher, but as a physicist. He was the first scientist to conduct rigorous, quantitative psychophysical experiments to actually measure the speed of the nervous system.
Which is a monumental shift in thinking. Because prior to Helmholtz's experiments, what was the prevailing scientific consensus on how fast nerves actually operated?
The consensus, championed by eminent physiologists like Johannes Müller, was that sensory signals traveled instantaneously. They believed nerve conduction was infinitely fast,
Or like the speed of light.
akin to the speed of light, or perhaps driven by some non-physical vital spirit. The assumption was that the moment you touch a hot stove, the sensation of heat is simultaneously present in your conscious mind.
Zero delay.
Zero delay. But Helmholtz proved that was physically impossible. He set up an experiment using the severed sciatic nerve of a frog attached to its calf muscle. He used a galvanometer and electrically stimulated the nerve at different distances from the muscle, measuring the tiny fractions of a second it took for the muscle to twitch.
And what did he find?
He discovered that nerve conduction is astonishingly slow. In a frog, it was only about 27 meters per second. In humans, it's roughly 50 to 60 meters per second. It is a physical, measurable, sluggish electrochemical wave.
That's incredibly slow compared to light. So, Helmholtz didn't stop there. He moved from frogs to live human subjects and measured reaction times.
Right, he would touch a subject on the toe and measure how long it took them to press a button, indicating they felt it, and then compare that to touching them on the thigh.
So the signal from the toe has further to travel up the leg.
Exactly. But what he found was that the human reaction time was significantly slower than what the nerve conduction speed alone would predict.
There was an unaccounted for delay. The signal traveled up the leg, hit the brain, and then it just stalled for a moment before the person consciously reacted.
What did Helmholtz deduce was happening during that delay?
That delay changed everything. Helmholtz deduced that the time gap between a sensory stimulus arriving in the brain and the conscious perception of that stimulus meant that a massive amount of brain work was occurring in the interim.
The brain was busy calculating, doing the raw math of cognition. Helmholtz concluded that the vast majority of what occurs in the human brain is completely non-conscious. What finally enters your consciousness, what you ultimately perceive, is heavily dependent on what he called unconscious inferences.
So the brain is guessing.
The brain receives raw, ambiguous evidence from the eyes and ears. A two-dimensional pattern of light hits the retina. From that flat, limited data, the brain essentially makes an educated, probabilistic guess. It infers the three-dimensional shape, the distance, and the identity of the object causing the light. And it executes all of this complex inferential mathematics without you ever being aware of the process.
I think of it like sitting in the audience of a massive, elaborate theater. You have your ticket, you are in your seat, and you are waiting for the show to start. The bell rings, signaling the start of the performance. But the curtain doesn't open immediately. There's a delay. Helmholtz was essentially saying, listen, if there is a delay between the bell ringing and the curtain opening, there must be a massive crew of stagehands working frantically in the dark, moving heavy props, setting up the lighting, and getting the actors into position.
And your conscious mind is just the audience member who only gets to see the final, polished scene once the curtain is finally lifted.
Right. But society in the 19th century, and honestly, many people today, absolutely refused to believe that the backstage crew existed. They were deeply hostile to Helmholtz's theory.
Oh, they hated it.
They wanted to believe that the actors just magically materialized on the stage. But if we dig into the historical context, the resistance wasn't because Helmholtz's math was wrong. The resistance was based entirely on philosophical and moral panic. Why were people so terrified of unconscious inference?
Because it threatens the bedrock of human agency and free will. The philosophical argument goes like this. Moral responsibility, the entire basis of human ethics and law, can only be assigned to decisions and actions that are based on conscious thought.
Right. You can only praise or blame a person if they consciously deliberated their choice.
Exactly. If Helmholtz is right, and the brain is making highly complex inferences, categorizations, and decisions prior to conscious awareness, where does that leave human responsibility? If the backstage crew is actually running the show and writing the script in the dark, how can you hold the audience member responsible for what happens on stage?
It makes us feel like passengers in our own bodies. So, because the philosophical implications were simply too disturbing, the scientific community largely marginalized Helmholtz's groundbreaking ideas about unconscious processing. They ignored the physics because they didn't like the philosophy.
They did, but, you can only ignore physics for so long. As we moved into the mid-20th century, science was violently forced to accept the reality of Helmholtz's backstage crew. And it wasn't a philosophical breakthrough that forced this acceptance.
It was a technological one.
Yes. This is the era that brought us the awakening of artificial intelligence.
And this is where the sheer complexity of perception becomes undeniable. Following the invention of the electronic computer, researchers looked at these massive machines that could calculate artillery trajectories and crack cryptographic codes in seconds.
And they thought, well, if you could do advanced calculus, teaching it to look at a picture and see shapes should be trivial.
In the 1960s, the pioneers of AI genuinely believed that computer vision was going to be a quick summer project.
They really did.
Yeah.
At MIT in 1966, there was this infamous initiative called the Summer Vision Project. Seymour Papert, a brilliant mathematician and computer scientist, essentially tasked a group of undergraduate students with solving the problem of machine vision over their summer break.
Which is just wild in retrospect. They vastly, almost comically, underestimated the problem.
They did. And we can't really blame them because they were victims of the illusion of effortless perception. When a human being looks out a window, they instantly see trees, buildings, overlapping cars, pedestrians.
You feel absolute no mental effort. It feels instantaneous and direct.
Right. The visual world simply presents itself to you as a fully formed reality.
So the early computer scientists assumed they just needed to plug a camera into a computer, write a few lines of code to detect the boundaries of objects, and the machine would see.
Let's break down why that was a catastrophic miscalculation. Because writing code to detect a visual edge sounds simple, but the reality of a cluttered physical environment turns it into a computational nightmare. If we just look at a normal office desk, you have overlapping pieces of paper. You have a coffee cup casting a dark shadow across a notebook. You have a pen that is half hidden underneath a keyboard.
So much visual noise.
How does a computer algorithm look at a two-dimensional array of pixels and figure out which edges belong to which objects?
That is exactly the problem that derailed early AI. An edge in an image is just a sharp change in pixel brightness. But how does the machine know that the sharp edge of a dark shadow isn't a solid physical object?
How does it know that the silver tip of a pen sticking out from the left side of a keyboard and the black end of a pen sticking out from the right side are actually the same continuous object, and not two separate pieces of plastic. A human infant can figure that out effortlessly through object permanence.
But teaching a machine to do it requires staggering amounts of mathematical computation regarding geometry, lighting gradients, spatial continuity, and statistical probability.
The computer has to calculate millions of variables just to draw a boundary around a coffee cup and separate it from the background.
Millions. So the failure of early AI to easily solve computer vision definitively revealed the staggering underlying neural processes on which our seemingly effortless human perception depends.
It proved mathematically that recognizing shapes, separating objects from backgrounds, and understanding depth requires an incredibly dense, multi-layered set of unconscious computations.
And this doesn't just apply to vision, right? It applies to all sensory modalities. Think about the computational power required to understand spoken language. Taking a continuous blended wave of sound frequencies and instantly segmenting it into distinct words, sentences, and emotional tones.
It's a massive processing load.
So combining Helmholtz's slow nerve conduction with the computational nightmares of early AI, we arrive at the modern consensus of cognitive neuroscience. And it is a profound realization. You are never conscious of cognitive processes. You are only conscious of your perceptions. You only experience the final rendered product.
That is the crucial takeaway.
If we pause and truly internalize what that means for a listener right now, someone walking their dog or commuting on a train or washing the dishes, what does it mean for their immediate daily reality?
It means that every single thing you are seeing, hearing, and feeling in this exact moment is a heavily processed, time-delayed reconstruction. You are not experiencing a live feed of reality. The photons bouncing off the trees, the sound waves of the traffic, that raw data hits your sensory organs and is then routed through millions of neural pathways. Your brain breaks the data apart, checks it against your vast library of memories, calculates probabilities, filters out irrelevant noise, and then, a fraction of a second in the past, it synthesizes a clean, heavily edited video stream that it presents to your conscious mind as reality.
You are completely blind to the massive industrial factory running the computations. You only get to stand in the quiet showroom and look at the final product.
It fundamentally alters how you trust your own senses.
It really does. And if artificial intelligence proved that the math of perception is incredibly complex, the clinical study of brain damage proves that this complex math can happen entirely in the dark, completely disconnected from conscious awareness, yet still capable of physically guiding our bodies.
Let's look at clinical evidence for that, starting with a phenomena that challenges the very definition of blindness. In the 1970s, a researcher named Lawrence Weisskranz delineated a condition known as blindsight.
Blindsight. It sounds like an oxymoron.
It is one of the most counterintuitive phenomena in all of neurology. To understand it, we need to trace the anatomy of vision. When light hits the retina, the primary pathway that generates conscious visual awareness routes that signal through the thalamus and back to the primary visual cortex, known as V1, which sits at the very back of the brain in the occipital lobe.
Okay, so blindsight occurs in patients who have suffered a localized lesion, perhaps from a stroke, that destroys a portion of V1.
Exactly. Because the primary visual cortex is damaged, the conscious experience of seeing is wiped out. If the damage is on the right side of V1, the patient will report being entirely pitch black blind in the left half of their visual field.
Subjectively to the patient, there is simply nothing there.
Total darkness.
Huh?
But Weisskranz discovered that if you place an object in that blind spot and force the patient to interact with it, their behavior defies their subjective experience. If a researcher flashes a light in the blind field and says, "Was the light moving up or down?" or "Was the object red or green?" the patient will understandably protest. They will say, "I am completely blind in that eye. I have no idea. I'm just guessing randomly." But when researchers analyze the data of those forced guesses, the patients are correct 80, sometimes 90% of the time.
Wait, really? If the primary visual cortex is dead and the person consciously sees nothing but darkness, how is their brain calculating the correct answer? Where is the data going?
It proves that the visual system is not a single road. It is a complex highway system with multiple older evolutionary backroads. While the massive superhighway leading to V1, the road that generates the conscious feeling of seeing, is destroyed, other older subcortical pathways are still functioning.
What kind of subcortical pathways?
For instance, roughly 10% of the optic nerve fibers bypass the primary visual cortex entirely and travel to an older midbrain structure called the superior colliculus, which is heavily involved in tracking movement and directing eye gaze.
So the raw sensory data is still entering the brain, and the unconscious machinery is still processing it.
Yes. The superior colliculus and other subcortical structures are running the math. They possess unconscious information about the location, movement, and even the color of the object. And crucially, this unconscious information is available to the motor system to guide behavior.
The patient's hand can reach out and accurately grasp an object that their conscious mind is entirely blind to. They are performing precise, environmentally adapted actions based on high-level visual data that never crosses the threshold into awareness.
It is a stunning decoupling of action from awareness.
It really is. Now, let's contrast blindsight with a completely different kind of neurological lesion, one that occurs not in the visual cortex, but higher up in the right parietal lobe. This condition is called unilateral neglect, and it's not a disorder of vision, is it?
No, it's a disorder of spatial attention. With unilateral neglect, the patient's eyes are structurally sound and their primary visual cortex is perfectly intact. The raw visual data from the entire field of view is successfully arriving in the occipital lobe.
So what's the problem?
The right parietal lobe, which acts as a massive attentional spotlight for the left side of space, is damaged. The result is a profound, almost unimaginable deficit in awareness. The patient completely ignores the entire left side of the world.
And it manifests in bizarre everyday behaviors, right? Like a patient might only eat the food on the right side of their plate, leaving the left half untouched because to their attentional network, it simply doesn't exist.
Yeah, they might only shave the right side of their face or only dress the right side of their body. And this attentional black hole can even apply to individual objects. If you ask them to draw a clock, they might cram all 12 numbers onto the right side of the circle.
The left side of space is simply deleted from their conscious reality, which sets the stage for one of the most famous and, frankly, most haunting experiments in the history of cognitive psychology. The burning house experiment, conducted by John Marshall and Peter Halligan. The textbook outlines this in figure 59-1. Let's walk through exactly what the researchers did, because it perfectly encapsulates everything we've discussed about the backstage crew of the brain.
Absolutely. Marshall and Halligan presented a patient suffering from severe left-sided unilateral neglect with a piece of paper containing two simple line drawings of a house. One house was positioned directly above the other. Now, the right sides of both houses, the side the patient's intact attentional spotlight could see, were completely identical. Same roof line, same windows, same front door.
But there was a massive difference on the left side.
A huge difference. The left side of the top house was perfectly normal. The left side of the bottom house was violently engulfed in bright red flames.
So you have a safe house and a house actively burning to the ground.
The researcher asked the patient a simple, direct question. Are there any differences between these two houses? The patient looks directly at the paper. Because their damaged parietal lobe fails to allocate any conscious attention to the left side of the drawings, they were completely unaware of the flames. The fire does not exist in their conscious mind, so the patient replies confidently, no, they look exactly the same.
They explicitly, consciously deny seeing the fire. But then Marshall and Halligan ask a seemingly nonsensical follow-up question. They say, okay, you think the houses are exactly the same, but if you were forced to choose, which house would you prefer to live in?
The patient is usually confused by the prompt, because why would you have a preference between two identical houses? But when forced to point to one, they reliably and consistently choose the top house, the safe house.
Let's dissect the neurological mechanics of this, because it's mind-bending. The patient looks at the paper. The light from the red flames hits the retina. The signal travels down the optic nerve and arrives at the primary visual cortex. The visual cortex successfully processes the edges, the color, and the shape of the fire.
Exactly. The primary visual cortex is doing its job. The raw physical sensation of the fire is registered by the brain.
But because the right parietal lobe is dead, that visual information cannot be routed into conscious awareness. The patient doesn't see it.
Yeah.
However, the visual cortex doesn't only talk to the conscious mind. Where else is it sending that data?
It routes that data down deeper unconscious pathways. Specifically, it sends signals to the limbic system, heavily involving the amygdala, which acts as the brain's rapid threat detection center. The amygdala receives the visual pattern of flames and instantly cross-references it with danger.
The backstage crew sees the fire and pulls the fire alarm.
Yes. The unconscious inference engine calculates a massive survival threat. It initiates an avoidance response. A decision is formulated entirely in the dark. Avoid the bottom house. That unconscious survival mandate is then sent to the motor cortex, dictating the patient's physical behavior. The patient raises their hand and points to the safe house.
But the most crucial part of this is the patient's internal narrative. If the researcher asks the patient, "Why did you point to the top house?" what happens?
The patient is placed in an impossible situation. Their conscious mind just watched their own hand point to a house, but the conscious mind has absolutely no access to the threat calculation that caused the movement. But the human brain abhors a vacuum of meaning.
It has to have reason.
So the conscious mind seamlessly confabulates. It invents a rational-sounding story to explain the unconscious behavior. The patient might say, I don't know, I think the roof on the top house looks a bit sturdier, or the bottom house just looks a bit drafty. They weave a fiction to explain an action that was actually driven by a blazing fire they couldn't see.
It forces you to wonder how many of our own daily choices, who we trust, what we buy, who we fall in love with, are actually driven by unseen fires, while our conscious minds just invent polite stories to explain it away.
It's a very unsettling thought.
But if the brain can process a burning house without us knowing, it demands an answer to the next logical question. What physically happens in the brain when a person does become conscious of something? What is the physical difference between the fire staying in the dark and us consciously seeing the flames?
This introduces the search for the neural correlates of consciousness, famously championed by Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, and neuroscientist Christoph Koff.
Right. And Crick and Koff realized that to find the specific biological mechanism of consciousness, you can't just put someone in a scanner and show them a picture.
Because if you show someone a picture of a face, millions of neurons fire. Some are processing the raw light, some are processing the shape, and some are generating the conscious feeling of seeing a face. To isolate just the consciousness neurons, you have to find a way to mathematically decouple the raw physical sensation, the light hitting the eye, from the psychological perception, what the mind actually experiences.
And cognitive psychology provided the perfect levers to do this, using specific types of optical illusions. Let's look at the first lever, which is ambiguous figures. These allow us to hold the physical sensation perfectly constant, while the conscious perception dramatically shifts. The classic example in the text is the Rubin figure.
That's the static image that you can interpret either as a single ornate vase in the center of the image, or as two human faces in profile looking directly at each other.
Yeah, and another elegant example is the Necker cube. It's a simple, two-dimensional line drawing of a wireframe cube.
The Necker cube is fascinating because it contains no depth cues. When you stare at it, your brain has to infer its 3D orientation. Initially, you might see the front face of the cube pointing down and to the left, but if you keep staring, the orientation will suddenly and spontaneously flip in your mind, and the front face will appear to point up and to the right.
You can actually feel your brain shifting gears. But the crucial physical fact here is that the image on the paper never moved. The stream of photons hitting your retina never changed. The raw sensation is completely static.
But the brain's unconscious inference engine finds two equally valid, mutually exclusive interpretations of that sensory data. And because the conscious mind can only harbor one unified reality at a time, your perception alternates between them.
Right. So in an experimental setting, if you put a subject in a scanner looking at a Necker cube, you know that any changes in their brain activity are not caused by changes in the outside world because the outside world is frozen.
Exactly. The changes in brain activity represent the physical machinery of the perception shifting from one state to another.
That is lever number one. Lever number two is the exact reverse. It's a phenomenon called change blindness, where we dramatically change the physical sensation, we alter the outside world, but the conscious perception remains stubbornly, rigidly constant. A researcher named Ron Rensink pioneered a brilliant experimental paradigm to demonstrate this.
Rensink's paradigm exploits a flaw in how our visual system updates its model of the world. Normally, if something changes in your environment, it creates a visual flicker of motion. Your peripheral vision detects that motion, and your attentional network instantly snaps your eyes to the change.
So Rensink wanted to bypass that motion detector. He took a complex photograph, for example, a large military transport plane sitting on an airport runway. He then created a second, modified version of that photo where he completely erased one of the massive jet engines hanging off the wing.
It's a huge, glaring physical change. If you put the photos side by side, a child could spot the difference in half a second.
But Rensink didn't put them side by side. He displayed them on a single computer screen, switching back and forth between the original image and the modified image. Crucially, though, he inserted a brief blank screen, just a flash of gray, for a fraction of a second between the two images.
And that tiny flash of gray completely short-circuits our biology. Because of the blank screen, the whole visual field flickers, which masks the specific local motion cue of the jet engine appearing and disappearing.
Because the automatic motion detection system is rendered useless, the brain is forced to rely on higher-level working memory. It has to consciously scan the image, memorize the location of every object, and compare it to the next image. And human visual working memory is shockingly limited.
As a result, subjects will stare at a screen where a massive jet engine is literally blinking in and out of existence, and it can take them minutes to notice it.
Their conscious perception of the airplane remains perfectly constant, even though the raw sensory stimulation is undergoing a massive continuous change. So, by utilizing these two levers ambiguous figures where sensation is constant but perception flips, and change blindness where sensation flips but perception is constant, researchers could place subjects into functional MRI scanners and precisely map the neural correlates of conscious awareness.
Which brings us to the architecture of how specific brain regions map to specific experiences. When neuroimaging was applied to these perceptual flips, two monumental discoveries emerged. The first was that specific categories of conscious experience are inextricably linked to heightened neural activity and highly specialized localized areas of the cerebral cortex.
We can trace this mapping using a fascinating experimental technique called binocular rivalry, highlighted in Figure 59-3 in a study by Tong and colleagues. Normal human vision relies on stereopsis, where both eyes look at the same object from slightly different angles, and the visual cortex fuses those two images into a single 3D perception.
But binocular rivalry intentionally breaks that system. To break it, the researchers used specialized goggles to project two completely different incompatible images into the subject's eyes. They showed a picture of a human face to the left eye and a picture of a house to the right eye.
The brain is receiving two entirely conflicting realities simultaneously. The left optic nerve is screaming face, and the right optic nerve is screaming house. How does the brain resolve that paradox?
It doesn't fuse them. Much like the Necker cube, the brain's conscious perception simply alternates. The subject consciously sees the face for a few seconds, then the image dissolves and they clearly see the house, and then it flips back to the face. Tong had the subjects lie inside a functional MRI scanner holding a button box and instructed them to press a button the exact moment their conscious perception flipped from the face to the house.
What are we actually measuring in the fMRI when they press that button?
An fMRI detects the BOLD signal blood oxygen level dependent contrast. When a specific cluster of neurons becomes highly active, they consume more oxygen. The brain responds by dilating blood vessels to send a surge of oxygen-rich blood to that exact millimeter of tissue. The MRI's magnetic field detects that rush of oxygen. It's a proxy for neural firing.
So, when the subject pressed the button saying, "I consciously see the face," where did the blood rush to?
It rushed to a very specific fold of tissue on the underside of the temporal lobe called the fusiform face area, or FFA. This region is highly specialized for processing the geometric configurations of facial features. When the FFA lit up, the subject experienced the face.
But when their perception flipped and they pressed the button saying, "Now I see the house," the activity in the FFA dropped drastically, and a massive surge of blood rushed to a different region called the perihippocampal place area, or PPA, which is specialized for recognizing environmental layouts in buildings.
The mapping is direct. Conscious experience of a face lives in the FFA. Conscious experience of a landscape lives in the PPA. The content of your consciousness is dictated by the specific geography of cortical activation.
And understanding this geography gives us an incredible scientific framework for understanding phenomena that historically were considered mystical or signs of madness. I'm talking about hallucinations.
Hallucinations are categorized as deviant perception. But neurologically, they obey the exact same physical laws as normal perception. If heightened activity in the FFA equals the conscious experience of seeing a face, what happens if the FFA just spontaneously fires on its own without any external light entering the eyes at all?
The brain would just conjure a face out of thin air, which is precisely what happens in a fascinating clinical condition known as Charles Bonnet syndrome.
Charles Bonnet syndrome typically occurs in elderly patients who are slowly going blind due to degenerative eye diseases like macular degeneration or severe glaucoma. The retina is dying, so the primary optic nerve stops sending sensory signals back to the visual cortex.
But the visual cortex itself, the massive array of processing machinery at the back of the brain, is perfectly healthy.
It's a massive, powerful computer that has suddenly been unplugged from its camera. And neural tissue does not like being idle. When the visual cortex is starved of external sensory input, the neurons undergo changes in excitability. They become hypersensitive, and eventually they begin to fire spontaneously in random patterns.
And because the spontaneous firing is happening in the regions of the brain responsible for generating conscious visual experience, the patients begin to experience incredibly vivid, complex visual hallucinations.
They start seeing things that aren't there. But crucially, because their frontal lobes, their reasoning centers, are intact, they usually know the hallucinations aren't real. They know they were going blind. They just have to sit there while their brain projects movies for them.
Right. A researcher named Dominic Fitch conducted landmark neuroimaging studies on patients with Charles Bonnet syndrome. He waited until a patient signaled they were having a hallucination, and he looked at where the blood flow was surging in their visual cortex. The hallucinations varied wildly from patient to patient. Some saw geometric grids or complex brick-like patterns. Some saw intense washes of color. Others saw disembodied, distorted faces floating in the room.
Fitch discovered that the specific visual content of the hallucination perfectly correlated with localized spontaneous activity in specific regions of the secondary visual cortex.
So if the color processing region fired spontaneously, the patient hallucinated a splash of color. If the fusiform gyrus fired, they hallucinated a face. The brain acts as its own projector, and wherever the electricity sparks, that dictates the shape of the ghost.
Exactly. And this principle extends far beyond visual blindness. It provides the mechanical basis for the hallucinations seen in major psychiatric illnesses like schizophrenia. Schizophrenic patients frequently suffer from highly distressing auditory hallucinations, hearing voices speaking to them, often criticizing or commanding them.
And when these patients are placed in an fMRI, we see that these auditory hallucinations are correlated with abnormal, heightened, localized activity in the auditory cortex, specifically in the temporal lobe. The brain is spontaneously generating the auditory percept of a voice, and the conscious mind experiences it as indistinguishable from an external speaker.
We've actually known this localization was possible for decades, long before the invention of fMRI, thanks to the pioneering open brain surgeries of Wilder Penfield in the 1950s.
Penfield was operating on patients with severe epilepsy. To find the source of the seizures, he had to operate with the patients fully awake under local anesthesia. He would expose the surface of the cerebral cortex and use a tiny electrical probe to stimulate different millimeter-sized regions of the brain, asking the patient what they felt.
He was manually playing the brain like a keyboard.
He was. And he found that applying a microcurrent to the somatosensory cortex caused the patient to feel a tingle in their thumb. Moving the probe a centimeter might cause them to feel a touch on their lip. Most remarkably, stimulating deeper areas in the temporal lobe could conjure vivid, complex, conscious experiences.
A zap to one area might cause a patient to suddenly hear a specific song from their childhood, playing clearly in their head. The electrical stimulation hijacked the cortical machinery and generated a conscious reality.
And today, we can achieve similar targeted disruptions without cutting open the skull, using a technology called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS.
TMS is a remarkable tool. It involves placing a powerful electromagnetic coil against the scalp. The coil generates a rapidly changing magnetic field, which passes painlessly through the skull and induces a weak electrical current in a highly targeted, localized area of the underlying cerebral cortex. It allows us to temporarily activate or suppress specific brain regions.
And if you aim that magnetic pulse at a specific area of the visual cortex, known as V5, or area MT, which is the region specialized for processing visual motion, the results are startling.
If you blindfold a subject, place them in a pitch-black room, and deliver a targeted TMS pulse to area V5, the induced electrical current will cause the motion processing neurons to fire. The subject will instantly report seeing a conscious visual perception of moving light, often described as shooting stars or flashes of lightning moving across their visual field.
You are artificially injecting a conscious experience of motion directly into the cortex. If we step back and synthesize all of this binocular rivalry, Charles Bonnet, Penfield, TMS, the profound overarching implication is that your conscious experience is inextricably tied to localized cortical activity. Your brain does not fundamentally require the outside physical world to generate reality. The machinery of perception can run entirely in a vacuum, driven by internal electrical sparks.
That is the first monumental discovery of the neural correlates of consciousness. But there is a second discovery that completely complicates the picture, and it is known as the necessary but not sufficient rule of awareness.
Let's unpack this apparent contradiction. Based on everything we just discussed, if my fusiform face area lights up with electrical activity, I should consciously experience seeing a face. It seems like a direct one-to-one equation. But you're saying that is not a guarantee.
It is absolutely not a guarantee, and the proof for this comes from taking the change blindness experiment, the one where people fail to notice massive changes on a screen, and conducting it inside an fMRI scanner. Researchers like Beck and colleagues did exactly this. They used a variation of the flicker paradigm, but instead of an airplane engine disappearing, they had a face on the screen that would subtly change its identity.
So they flash face A, blank screen, face B, blank screen, back and forth.
Right, and because of change blindness, sometimes the subjects consciously noticed the face changing, and they would press a button. But often, the subjects were completely blind to the change. They would stare directly at face B and swear it was still face A.
The conscious mind failed to register the new face. But what did their underlying brain activity look like during those failures?
That is the critical revelation, detailed in Figure 59-5. When the face changed on the screen, the raw visual data of face B entered the eye, traveled to the occipital lobe, and routed into the fusiform gyrus. Even when the subject was completely consciously unaware that the face had changed, the fMRI showed that the fusiform face area still significantly activated.
Wow.
The specialized neural machinery processed the new face, but the subject remains subjectively blind to it.
The FFA firing is necessary to see a face, but its firing is clearly not sufficient on its own to make you aware that you are seeing a face. So if the specialized region is doing the work, what is the critical missing ingredient that actually flips the switch of consciousness?
The neuroimaging revealed that for the sensory data in the FFA to cross the threshold into conscious awareness, there must be an additional massive surge of synchronized neural activity in higher-order association areas. Specifically, a vast network spanning the parietal and frontal cortices.
The frontoparietal network.
Yes. When the subjects did consciously notice the face changing, the fMRI showed the fusiform area lighting up, accompanied by an explosive coordinated activation of the frontal and parietal lobes. This aligns with what is called the global workspace theory of consciousness.
It's like the hierarchy of a major newspaper. The fusiform gyrus is a specialist journalist out in the field. The journalist observes an event, gathers the data, and writes a detailed article about a face. The journalist writes that article whether anyone reads it or not. That's the FFA firing unconsciously. But the frontal and parietal cortices act as the powerful editor-in-chief sitting at the desk. The article gets transmitted from the FFA to the editor. If the editor decides the article isn't important, it gets spiked, and it never sees the light of day. But if the editor-in-chief signs off on it, they publish it onto the front page, the global workspace, broadcasting it to the rest of the brain. Only when it hits the front page do you consciously experience it.
That hierarchy perfectly explains the difference between unconscious computation and conscious awareness. The specialized sensory cortices process the raw data, but the frontoparietal network must actively amplify and broadcast that data for it to become a conscious percept. And with this editor-in-chief rule in mind, we can look back at the mysteries of brain damage, like the burning house experiment in unilateral neglect, and the paradoxical mechanics become crystal clear.
Let's reanalyze that patient. They have a lesion in their right parietal cortex. So they look at the drawing. The red flames on the left side of the house enter their eye. The data hits their visual cortex. The specialized journalist writes a highly detailed article screaming, "There is a massive fire."
And that unconscious article is routed to the amygdala, triggering the survival circuits that cause the patient to point to the safe house.
But why don't they consciously see the flames? Because the editor-in-chief is dead.
Exactly. The lesion in the right parietal cortex physically destroyed a critical node of the frontoparietal network. The bridge required to take the visual data and broadcast it into the global workspace is severed. The article about the fire is written. It heavily influences survival behavior downstream, but it can never be published onto the front page of the patient's conscious mind.
It is a breathtaking mechanical explanation for a psychological mystery. But when you uncover a mechanism like this, it immediately raises an evolutionary question. Why on earth would biology build such a convoluted two-tier system? Why rely on deep, highly capable unconscious processing that requires a secondary metabolic-heavy sign-off from a cortical editor just to be aware of it? Why not just have one unified system that sees everything instantly?
Because a unified conscious system would be far too slow to keep you alive in a hostile environment. Evolution operates under immense selective pressure, and when it comes to predatory threats, speed is infinitely more valuable than high-resolution accuracy. The architecture of our brain reflects this by maintaining two distinct parallel recognition systems. a fast, low-resolution unconscious system and a slow, high-resolution conscious system.
Let's map out how those two pathways operate in a real-world scenario. If I'm walking through the woods and I see a long, curved shape in the glass.
The visual data enters your thalamus, which is the brain's central relay station. The thalamus instantly splits the signal. It sends one copy of the data down a fast, direct, myelinated low road straight to the amygdala. This low road bypasses the cortex entirely. It doesn't have the processing power to determine exactly what the object is, but it runs a rapid pattern match for danger. It detects a snake-like shape, and within milliseconds, it triggers an autonomic fear response. Your heart rate spikes, your muscles tense, and you physically jump backward.
I jump before I even consciously know why I'm jumping.
Yes, because meanwhile, the thalamus sent a second copy of the visual data up the high road to the visual cortex and the frontoparietal network. This system is slow. It takes hundreds of milliseconds to calculate the edges, the color, the texture, and to check those features against your memory banks. Finally, the cortical editor publishes the finding to your conscious mind. It's not a snake, it's just a curved garden hose.
The fast unconscious system keeps you alive. The slow conscious system allows you to learn, adapt, and stop panicking over garden hoses.
Precisely. We can actually measure the activity of that fast, unconscious emotional system using an incredibly sensitive physiological metric called skin conductance.
Let's break that down because it's a vital tool in these clinical studies. What exactly is skin conductance measuring?
It measures the activity of your sympathetic nervous system, your fight-or-flight response. When your amygdala detects a threat, or even just an emotionally salient stimulus like a familiar face, it sends signals down your spinal cord to the eccrine sweat glands in your skin, particularly on your palms and fingers. These glands instantly secrete microscopic amounts of sweat. Sweat contains salt, which makes your skin slightly more electrically conductive. By placing two small electrodes on a person's fingers, we can measure microscopic drops in electrical resistance. It provides a real-time, objective readout of unconscious emotional arousal, entirely bypassing what the patient consciously claims to feel.
We can use the body to eavesdrop on the unconscious mind. And researchers use this exact technique to unlock the mechanics of prosopagnosia face blindness. We established earlier that these patients have damage to the slow, conscious recognition system. The fusiform face area, or its connections, are broken. They cannot consciously name or recognize the face of their own spouse.
But the fast unconscious emotional pathway, the low road connecting the visual system to the amygdala, is often perfectly intact. Researchers placed skin conductance electrodes on patients with prosopagnosia and showed them a rapid sequence of photographs. Mixed in with pictures of random strangers were pictures of the patient's close family members.
Consciously, the patients reported that every single photo was a complete stranger.
But the electrodes told a completely different story. Whenever a photograph of a family member appeared on the screen, the patient's skin conductance spiked. Their sympathetic nervous system reacted.
The body recognized the spouse, even if the conscious mind was blind to it.
Exactly. The fast, unconscious emotional system successfully executed the pattern match. It recognized the identity and triggered the familiar, warm, autonomic feeling that belongs to that specific person. But because the slow, conscious visual identification system is shattered, the patient feels a surge of emotional familiarity, but they have absolutely no conscious context for why they are feeling it, and they cannot put a name to the face.
It is a tragic disconnection, but cognitive neuroscience is filled with inversions. There is a psychiatric condition that acts as the exact mirror image anatomical opposite of prosopagnosia, and the resulting delusion is arguably one of the most terrifying, deeply unsettling experiences a human mind can endure. The condition is called Capgras syndrome.
Capgras syndrome is a highly specific, targeted delusion. It is occasionally seen as a symptom of schizophrenia, but it also frequently manifests after traumatic brain injuries, strokes, or in the progression of neurodegenerative diseases like Lewy body dementia. A patient suffering from Capgras develops a firm, unshakable, utterly rigid belief that someone very close to them, almost always a spouse, a parent, or a child, has been murdered or removed and replaced by a physically identical imposter.
The patient looks at the person they have loved for decades and says, "You look exactly like my husband. You sound like my husband. You have his memories, but you are not him. You are an alien or a government clone or a demon wearing his face."
It is an absolute nightmare for the family, and it is not a harmless passive belief. It causes profound distress. Patients will often call the police to report a home intruder or violently demand that the imposter pack their bags and leave the house immediately. For decades, psychiatry was completely baffled by the etiology of this delusion. How can a brain perfectly process the visual geometry of a face, acknowledge that it is a 100% physical match, yet fiercely believe the person is a fake? Freudians tried to explain it as deeply repressed psychodynamic hostility bubbling to the surface, but that failed to explain why it frequently occurred after focal brain lesions.
The mechanical solution to the mystery was finally proposed by cognitive researchers Hadin Ellis and Andy Young. They introduced a brilliant conceptual leap known as the mirror hypothesis.
Ellis and Young looked at the dual pathways of recognition, the slow, conscious path and the fast, autonomic path, and they made a breathtaking deduction. They proposed that Capgras syndrome is the exact anatomical mirror of prosopagnosia. In a Capgras patient, the slow, conscious face recognition circuitry, the fusiform face area, and its connections to the frontoparietal editor is perfectly intact.
So the visual data comes in, the journalist writes the article, the editor publishes it, and the conscious mind says, visual match confirmed, that face belongs to my husband.
Right. But the neural pathway that connects that high-level visual recognition down to the fast, autonomic, emotional circuitry of the amygdala has been physically severed by a lesion or disease.
The emotional response is dead.
Completely flatlined. And researchers proved this by using skin conductance on Capgras patients. When shown pictures of the person they believe is an imposter, their skin conductance does not change. There is zero autonomic arousal. They exhibit the exact same physiological indifference as they would looking at a picture of a coffee cup.
This is where we have to deeply empathize with the patient and reconstruct the sheer terror of their internal logic. Because if you put yourself in the mind of a Capgras patient, their cognitive deduction isn't crazy. It is terrifyingly rational based on the broken data they are receiving.
Let's walk through that deduction. The patient looks across the kitchen table at their spouse. The visual cortex operates flawlessly. It identifies the geometry of the face, accesses the memory banks, and says, "That is your spouse." Based on decades of conditioning, the patient's brain expects that visual recognition to be instantly accompanied by a warm, familiar, autonomic rush of emotion, the physiological signature of love and intimacy.
But the pathway is cut. The autonomic nervous system remains completely silent. The body feels absolutely nothing. It is a profound, chilling, emotional void.
It creates a catastrophic cognitive mismatch. The conscious mind is presented with two contradictory streams of data. Visual match 100%. Emotional match, 0%. The human brain is an inference engine. It is biologically driven to resolve paradoxes and make sense of its internal state. The cognitive mind cannot simply accept this horrific discrepancy. It has to rationally explain it.
It can't just say, oh, I guess my amygdalofusiform pathway is damaged today. It has to build a narrative.
Exactly. So the reasoning centers of the brain evaluate the broken data and draw the only logical conclusion that fits the facts. This entity sitting across from me looks exactly flawlessly like my husband, but when I look at them, I feel absolutely no emotional connection, no warmth, no familiarity. Therefore, despite the physical resemblance, this cannot possibly be my husband. The only rational explanation is that this is a meticulously constructed imposter.
That is the pivotal paradigm-shifting insight of the Ellis and Young hypothesis. Capgras is not fundamentally a disorder of reasoning. The logic the patient uses is actually flawless.
The reasoning is perfectly sound. The tragedy is that the perfectly logical deduction is built upon a fundamentally disordered, organically broken foundation of unconscious emotional data. The conscious mind is desperately trying to write a rational story to explain a terrifying mechanical failure in the dark room of the unconscious.
It is a sobering, humbling realization about the fragility of the human mind. We have covered an immense expanse of neurological territory today in part 1 of this deep dive into Chapter 59.
We truly have. We trace the historical evolution from Hermann von Helmholtz's deeply unpopular discovery of slow nerve conduction and unconscious inference, past the shattered expectations of early AI researchers in the 1960s, all the way to modern fMRI machines measuring blood flow in the fusiform gyrus. The overwhelming consensus of this journey is that the vast majority of our perceived reality is computed entirely in the dark, without our permission and without our awareness.
The overarching lesson is that we are not the directors of our perception. We are merely the final audience. We are the recipients of the brain's heavily edited, heavily delayed draft of reality. The frontoparietal editor decides what makes it onto the front page of consciousness, and the unimaginable complexity of the remaining data is locked away in the dark.
But it's vital to remember that in this first part of the Enkephalikos series, we have only discussed the sensory input. We've only explored how the brain constructs perception.
Right. which serves as the perfect bridge into our next session. Because in part 2 of this deep dive into Chapter 59, we are going to pivot from how we perceive the world to how we interact with it. We are going to explore how the control of our physical actions is also driven by massive, unseen, unconscious forces. We will investigate the clinical cases of patients who can physically coordinate the complex motor task of mailing a letter through a narrow slot, while consciously having absolutely no idea what a mail slot is or where it is located in space.
We will also dive into the highly controversial, deeply unsettling neuroscience behind human agency, exploring the phenomenon of intentional binding, and questioning the biological reality of our sense of free will.
It is going to challenge everything you think you know about your own choices. But before we conclude today's session, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We just spent a significant amount of time breaking down the terrifying logic of Capgras syndrome. We learned that a single severed emotional circuit can seamlessly, flawlessly convince a person's conscious, rational mind that their own spouse is an alien imposter, simply because the brain is desperately trying to construct a logical narrative out of broken unconscious data. So my question for you is this. As you look at your own life, your own political stances, your interpersonal conflicts, and your deep-seated judgments, what perfectly logical, rigidly held everyday beliefs are you harboring right now that are not based on objective reality, but are merely your conscious mind inventing a polite story to explain away an unseen quirk, bias, or emotional misfire in your own unconscious wiring?
It is a deeply humbling mirror to hold up to ourselves.
Think about the mechanics of the backstage crew the next time you feel absolutely, unconditionally certain about why you made a decision. We will see you in part 2.